Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I'll be talking about how to handle nulls or empty results using JdbcTemplate. I go one step ahead, that it's not in the title. What happens if we expect one row, but we are receiving more than one row? That's something that sometimes happens, and it happened to me in some of the projects that I work on in my past. So we'll be talking about why nulls and empty results matter, safer alternatives to query for object, because when we want to get a specific row, usually we want to use query for object, but sometimes it's not the best approach. Then we probably can use query to return a list of values, and then we can take a decision from that. It's one strategy, but we will see others. Then another approach is to using wrapping results in an optional. Imagine that we don't find any row, but we're expecting to find one. What should we return? Null, empty list, optional, and if you already use the optional, you know probably it is the best strategy because it avoids things like NullPointerException. Then we will see what is the influence of these decisions if you are using a REST API to return these values, and we'll see some common use cases about this subject. So let's move forward. So why this matters? Nulls and empty results are common in database queries a lot. We are trying to find something and maybe it's there, maybe it's not. Because usually the systems nowadays, even database, are used for several services. And maybe we are inserting some data in our application and we swear that the row is there, but maybe another system remove that row from there. So poor handling can lead to null pointer exceptions, misleading responses, broken logic, something that can happen when we don't handle the empty results or null values. And the graceful handling improves code robustness, readability and maintainability and user experience. I think it's easy to understand why. Common JDBC pitfalls. Imagine that you have a query like this one where we get the name of a user based on one ID and we expect one row. When we do a query that contains the ID, we expect that exists. Maybe, okay, there are exceptions when I say, now I want to check if the user exists. Okay, that's fair. But usually the majority of the queries, when we use something like this, we expect users to exist because we are getting the name. We are not counting the number of users, it's just a name. And the query is quite simple. It's just JdbcTemplate, query for object, string class, which is something that we want to be mapped, and the parameter, which will be the user ID. But if the user is not found, we will receive this exception. But there is another exception that can happen, which is this one. Incorrect result size that access exception that happens when we expect one row but we have more than one. This one I already talked about in a previous video about possible exceptions that can be returned by JdbcTemplate, but this one can also happen. So how to handle this kind of scenarios? One, we can try to use the query. Query returns a list, so it's safe. So we fix the issue about having multiple, so we avoid this exception. Even the empty will be avoided because there will be no rows, but the list will be empty. But I would say that if you are trying to get one row and you receive more than one, maybe you want to log this information as a warning to say, hey, I was expecting one row, but I received multiple ones. But you can decide or say, okay, I will not throw a hard exception here, a fatal exception, but I would say, okay, if it's empty, I'll return null. And if there are more than one, I'll just get the first one. So I avoid the exception, but I advise you, please put some logging here so someone can check what's happening with this table. That's something that should be a primary key, contains more values than expected. But this avoids exceptions and it gives explicit control over empty results. Another way to do it, and it improves this one, I don't like the return values, is to use the optional. The optional was created to avoid null because the returning null sometimes we don't understand the purpose. Null can mean I couldn't find your information, or we can say that it's maybe something happened, an exception was thrown, I didn't want to rethrow the exception, so I'm returning null. Sometimes it's quite vague about the purpose. But when we throw something or return something like optional, what we are saying, or you have a value or it's empty. That's why we are doing here. So we have this list. We are find username based on ID. Again, the same query. But here you say, okay, return name string find first. And the find first is quite nice using the strings because the find first will return empty, an optional, or the value. And you can do this to transform this code and in this one in a more, let's say, elegant way. But again, I still think that you should put here logging warning, say, okay, I found more than one row which was not expected on this method. Okay, now you have a REST API that probably want to return this information, and now you are receiving an optional, and you want to follow the good practice of REST APIs, and I will be creating several videos about it. I have created a few of them that I deploy them on the channel, but I will create others about versioning and good practice and REST API. But again, you receive on the REST API, what should you return when there is no value? The best way, if the purpose of the method was to find something like users, get a user by name, you want to inform the user using the standard. And you can say, okay, here is your username that you asked me for. So I will respond with OK, which means a 200 in HTTP codes, or else if it's empty, that's one of the advantages of using the optional here, I will respond with not found. So the client that is consuming REST API understands that, okay, you couldn't find what I asked for. Because if you test here for null, how do you know that the null, it's because it's a not found or an issue? Maybe it shouldn't be a not found, but maybe a server error or something like that, that you should throw because something happened. But you just want to throw server errors when you really have exception. So not found, it's not a bad thing. Sometimes people see not found and say, okay, something wrong happened. No, it's not something wrong. There is no, it's a business thing. I couldn't find what we are looking for. But people usually map this code to lack of pages, but that's a bad design of the site. It's not a bad design of a REST API. Okay, another use case, it's aggregates. When you aggregate information, again, you can use the optional get user post count. You want to count the number of posts and you select the count. This always returns a value. So here you don't have a lot of problems. You don't expect of nullable. That can happen, and it's still a good practice to use optional because there are some SQL idioms that if you perform some joins, the count can be null. Because the join didn't happen, or maybe you are counting something on the table, a left join, for instance, counting something there, but it's null, and there are some database that can return you null. It's not normal for this to happen, but can happen, and you have to play the safeguard, and to play the safeguard, always use optional, you say option nullable, and you use the count, and you are safe, because if it's null, it will be empty. Here, if it's not null, it will return the value. Okay. Use case on the business logic here, it's the same concept, but you have this limit here. So you have again the find last order for user, again a filter, but in this case you are ordering and you are using the limit one, you just want one row, but that doesn't mean that exists. Okay, so list order again, JdbcTemplate query, the same query as we were seeing, and then you return the find first. So it avoids exception if user has no orders, because you are returning this. Remember that the filter for a specific user, and it's better domain logic, the optional order. So this limit one, it's a quite nice solution because it makes sure that it's only one and you defend the result using the optional. That's another strategy that you can use. So in summary, prefer query over query for object when unsure of results. It doesn't mean, okay, I will start to use query because it's safe. No, if your application is well designed, use the query for object, it's great. You just do a try catch on the empty exception and things like that. But if you start to have the other exception with multiple results, maybe you are using a legacy application, you are migrating, and there are some troubles, let's say, in your database, then I will say that start to use query, make sure that until the database is clean, maybe create a user story as a technical debt for in the future to return to this subject and start to remove the queries and move to query for objects. It's not a big impact on the performance, but it's quite strange. Every time we want a specific row and we expect more than one, something is wrong. And later when someone looks into the code, say, was the person that developed like this? Because this is the primary key. Probably didn't understood the context at the time. So you can always combine your technical skills with management skills with your manager and make sure that in the future this issue will be addressed. Wrap results in an optional, it's always a good practice. That's the reason to create the optionals. Always check for isEmpty or findFirst. findFirst assures you that only one is returned. Only handle empty in controller service clearly. If you defend well on the repository, on the controller, you should defend yourself and make sure that you return the value with one OK, and if it's empty, just return 404. And of course, the front-end team should understand why are you using this. Maybe you can use Swagger or the other ways to document this information, so the client that is consuming your REST API understands what's happening and the reason for the different codes. And use functional patterns to reduce noise. Like the functional patterns is when you use the option, you have the or else and things like that you can use on the same statement. So in conclusion, graceful null and empty results handling prevents runtime errors. Communicate absence clearly because you understand it's empty. The name is already saying optional empty. I don't have a value for you. I know what happened, so we don't have it for you. Encourage safer and cleaner code. Embrace optional, query, and defensive design. So thank you for watching these slides. I will provide you now just a simple example because in our application we already provided this implementation. I was using this, but I want to show you where, so you can see that our code is being developed in a very following good practices. So just give me a moment. So we have here our user repository, and if you try to find the method here, get user by ID, you can see that I have this select here, and I'm using return optional of nullable in case that there's nothing happen here. Okay, but I'm catching if nothing was found here. I have empty result at access exception, and I'm returning empty. Maybe you can say this is redundant. Maybe it is, but I want to show you for educational purpose that you can catch this exception. It's a good practice, and return the empty. If you want to follow a list approach, and I've added this for educational purpose for this video, you can use like this rather than use the query for object here, where you provide user row mapper here. By the way, this user row mapper was an example. It's a method here that we can use, just map CID username. The attributes I didn't want to, because it can be reused by other methods. So sometimes I just create a private method and put it here, and that can be reused in several places. Like get user by username, it's the same row mapper, get user by ID, because I'm always mapping the same columns to attributes, in case you were wondering why there is a method here and not the expected functional interface or the lambda. Okay, but as I was saying, so we have this list, so we are using the query here, and again you have the user row mapper here, and here I'm just saying return user is empty. Okay, these users, if the list is empty, it means that no results were found, so I will return the optional empty, otherwise option of the first row that I found. So these two lines are really defensive. I don't need to do this catch because there is no exception when it's empty for the lists, only for the specific user when we do the query for object. And on the REST controller, you can see here when we get the user by ID, we get the optional, the service requests the repository returns the optional, and the service also returns the optional to the REST API, and the REST API now can take a great decision, meaning, okay, if there is a value, just do a response entity, okay, response with this user. If it's empty, just respond with not found, and that's what the client will receive. So let's see this working. So imagine that we have these users, we have this, let's put here user 1, that I know that exists this user, so I'll play. And you can see the user was returned as expected. But now if I put something like a user, let's say 5, that I think it doesn't exist, I don't have 5 users, you can see that, okay, it was okay, just a 404. There is no error, no exception, no strange output, nothing, it's just okay. There are no users to be displayed. I couldn't find the user 5 that you request for. So this is what I want to show you about graceful handle nulls and empty results, and what are the best strategies to do this. You can use these strategies for JdbcTemplate, even for other technology. You can apply the same concepts, maybe not the same statements because you don't have query or query for object, but if you think there could be some misleading results, you can also use these strategies. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you like it. I hope you continue to see my videos. Please share with your friends, share it on your channel if you have, and it's always a motivation for me. And again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next videos.